Welcome to Tips and Tricks for Bryce 7. These tips should be most useful for beginners, though there are several things here that even more advanced users might not have thought of. Especially since Bryce has never really had a single comprehensive guide that would show all of its useful and sometimes downright hidden features. Some of these tips and tricks are really just my preferred way of going about accomplishing various things, of course. But I think most Bryce users will at least find a few things here that might be helpful. Please feel free to message me through Reddit or YouTube, whichever platform you're viewing this on, if you have any questions. Now let's get started. So first things first, let's make sure that we're starting out with the best document settings. Even if we ultimately want our final render to be at a different resolution, while we're actually working on it, it makes sense to set that document size so that it takes up the entire available space on our screen so we can see as much as possible at any given moment, but never so big that we end up having to scroll around to see areas that don't fit on our monitors. Luckily, Bryce calculates that precise size for us. That's why I recommend always starting out at the max recommended set resolution. We can change it once we're ready to do our final render if we want, of course. But for now, let's just go to our File menu and select Document Setup. Select Max Recommended and click on OK, which is the little check mark at the lower right part of the window for you noobs. And we're ready to go. Now when we start a new document, or just run Bryce, the initial window looks like this, which is kind of an odd way to start, really. The director's point of view is set looking diagonally across the default plane, and it's not at all clear which direction is X and which is Z, unless you have the handy diagram I've placed here, of course. I usually only end up having to just try moving things around to figure out which direction is which each time. It would be much more clear if we started out with the X being straight left and right, the Z axis being forward and back, and the Y axis being up and down. What's also strange is that the default camera point of view is the exact opposite as the director's, so that when we can see it looking right back at us in the center of the screen, why would we want to have the camera and the director looking in opposite directions? So, let's fix both of these issues and have Bryce start out with these fixes already in place. So the first thing we want to do is set the camera and the director's default point of view both to be from the south, looking north, quote unquote. The easiest way to do this accurately is to switch to the top-down orthographic view with the view gadget, which is up just below the thumbnail preview in the upper left corner of the Bryce interface. As we can see here, the camera starts out in the northwest corner looking southeast. So first, let's drag it down to the bottom of the top-down view window. Then we'll want to rotate it to face straight north. The easiest way to do this is by clicking on the A button that appears next to the camera when we have it selected, setting the rotation of the camera's Y-axis to 0, and clicking OK. Next, we need to click on the little triangle menu doodad, as indicated here, and select Director to Camera. Even though it's not graphically represented like the camera is here, we still want our director's point of view oriented in the same direction. Now, one last thing we need to do before we can save is we need to nudge our camera back behind the director's view a little bit, so that way we don't accidentally select the camera when we're trying to deal with other objects. So we have to move it back just a little bit. We can drag it or use the reposition tool on the edit panel up top and drag it on the Z axis. And when we return to the director's view, now to move objects left or right, we simply use the reposition tool's X axis. To move them toward or away from us, we use the Z axis. And to move them up or down, we use the Y axis, which really helps keeping things straight. Dragging and dropping objects is something I don't recommend doing in the director or camera views because it's very hard to place anything correctly if you're always moving it in 3 dimensions all at once. In either of the two 3D perspectives, camera or director, it's much easier to just stick with the reposition tools to isolated axes, trust me. Save the dragging and dropping for the orthographic views where movement is restricted to only 2 dimensions at a time. And there it's quite effective. One last thing I want to mention before we save our changes, well, before or after actually, because it doesn't matter when we do it, is that I like to use the black background. It's just easier on the eyes. Sometimes one of the other options may be better for a particular situation, but just in general, I like the black, so I'm going to click on the background paper button and select the background that works best for me. You can choose your favorite. The grid choices, by the way, is very useful sometimes, but so bright it's hard on the eyes. Okay, so with that taken care of, we now want to save our camera and view settings, so we will start here each time we boot up Bryce. To do this, we click on the File menu and select Save or Save As, and then we need to navigate to the Bryce install directory, which is usually going to be C drive, program files x86, Days 3D, and then Bryce 7 as shown here. If you don't find yours at this location, just right-click on whatever icon or start menu item that you use to start Bryce and select Go to File Location from the menu that pops up, and then you can navigate along that directory chain in this menu. So now once we're in the Bryce 7 install folder, we need to save our document as default, quote-unquote default, with no embellishments, just as shown here. If it asks you if it's okay to override an existing file or if you have permission to save files in the directory, the answer to both is yes. And then we're done. Now, whenever you start Bryce, you'll have the point of view that makes things simple and the document set for the largest workspace your monitor can display without having to scroll around all the time. All right, now moving on. One of the challenges to using Bryce effectively for modeling is managing your camera and viewport. It's nice to have the freedom of just floating around the scene in the director's view, but it can cause real problems. For example, from the director's point of view, you would think that this cylinder and sphere are the same size and exist in the exact same spot in space. But when we switch to the top orthographic view, it becomes clear that neither of these things is true. Rotating the director's view around a scene would also show us this, but you'd have to be constantly moving it around instead of actually getting things done. Besides which, I know that Bryce is an easy program to use when you just want to eye things and not get bogged down with precise measurements and all that. That's part of its charm for artists, I'm sure. But even very small imprecisions have a way of becoming more and more of a problem the further we progress on our model. Anyone who's ever built a house knows that if a foundation is even slightly out of square, by the time you get around to putting on a roof or hanging doors or doing sheetrock, things are noticeably crooked and it's almost impossible to fix them without tearing it all down and starting over. I can't even begin to estimate the number of times I've had to literally start a whole model over because I had eyed things wrong at the beginning. By using the orthogonal views, top, front, side, etc., or orthographic, whichever word you prefer, we can still eye out our measurements, but are always going to be way more precise in those estimations. When we move this sphere back to the same spot as the cylinder on our z-axis and switch back to director with the tilde key, we can see the true difference in size as well as how far off on the x-axis we were from center. So it becomes obvious how valuable the ortho views are right away. We can switch between the views using the view control gadget in the upper left corner of the Bryce interface, though it can be a little fiddly trying to quickly switch to the view you want at any given moment, which is why the view hotkeys are so valuable. You've got one hand on the mouse or graphics tablet, and the other hand is just sitting there on the keyboard waiting for something to do anyway, so why not let it make your life easier and teach us some basic hotkeys, right? For example, pressing the 2 key, not the number pad 2, of course, but the 2 key that's just above the W key, will instantly take us to the top ortho view. In this view, our axis points directly to the left and right, our x-axis, that is, and our z-axis is straight up and down. Notice in the lower right corner of the interface we have the zoom in and zoom out control as well as the pan control, which looks like a little hand. These are especially handy. See what I did there? Sorry, just kidding. Because when we click on zoom in or out, Bryce will automatically center whatever objects we have selected, which is invaluable if you lost something in your scene. It's really easy to accidentally send an object off to some distant land way off where you can't see it anymore. Then how do you find it and get it back into the zone where you want it? Well, you can use the selection tools down at the bottom of the interface, which we'll discuss later, probably in the next video actually. Or you can even just select all the objects that you can see, like this, and then go to the Edit menu, click on Invert Selection, or press Ctrl-Shift-A, which will select everything that's not currently visible, like our lost objects. Now, make sure you're on your top ortho view and click on the Zoom Out tool. Your lost object will be at the center of the view, and if you keep clicking zoom out, eventually, depending on just how far it's wandered, the rest of your scene will fit in the viewport as well. Et voila! And then it's easy to move your lost item back to its proper location. The panning control lets us move the ortho views as needed. Again, very handy. When you zoom in, really, I'm sorry for that. It's just too stupid to resist. Anyway, that's just one advantage of using the top ortho view and its hotkey, which is 2. Next, we can press the 3 key, which will take us to the right side orthogonal view. Looking at our scene from right or left side means that the z-axis is now left and right, and the y-axis is up and down. This is a great view for making sure that objects are aligned with the ground plane and judging how high our water plane sits above the ground, determining if something is further away or closer to the camera, etc. The 4 key is for the front ortho view. From here, our x-axis is once again left and right, and the y-axis is again up and down. Now to get back to the director's point of view, we press the tilde key, which is just left of the 1 key. Being able to switch between these views rapidly saves a ton of time and helps to get objects placed precisely where we want them. In crowded scenes, these alternate views can be extremely helpful to find and select a particular object that may have many other objects crowded around it. What about the other number keys, the 5, 6, 7, etc.? We'll get back to them in a minute. For now, I want to talk about a few things in the director's view. First, I want to stress to you that using the zoom and pan controls in orthogonal views is absolutely critical and shouldn't cause any problems. However, in director's or camera view, they create a huge problem. The view becomes distorted and the camera controls become misaligned, and other problems that are too complex to describe in this tutorial. Just trust me, do not use zoom or pan in the director or camera views. If you end up accidentally doing so, however, we can fix it. By pressing this little triangle doodad right here between the view and camera controls, we can choose Reset Views from the pop-up menu, which will get us back to normal. Unfortunately, though, this will also move the camera view back to its unintuitive default location, though that's an acceptable drawback. Now, another thing I think that makes life much easier, especially for modeling, is to change the director's camera controls. What I mean is, if we change the director's view from trackball, which I find utterly useless, the 2 options that I use are the tripod, or second, my favorite, is center to selection. With this option, basically, whatever you're working on will sit in the same spot as you spin your view around it, which is just like the little platter that sculptors use to spin their clay or stone to access it from all sides. It's called a rotary table, also sometimes referred to as a sculptor's turntable or a model maker's turntable. Try it and you'll see what I mean. I should point out, though, that if you're working on a landscape or placing large terrain objects, this option is not terribly convenient, and you'll probably want to switch back to tripod or whatever. Another useful viewing tool is the memory dots. The memory dots will save our current view and allow us to quickly access it again. Just click on a blank dot to save your view, and click on a used dot to switch back to that view. You can hold Alt while clicking on a dot to clear it. And now we return to our view hotkeys. The 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 keys at the top of the keyboard will switch our view to the corresponding views that we have saved in the memory dots, though only the first 5. So by the way, you can see here that that object that had wandered off and we had to return home was in fact a lava lamp for this scene. Yeah. Okay, moving on. So once a scene or model gets to be more cluttered than we would like, a very powerful feature is soloing. We can isolate a group or set of objects that we want to focus on and make everything else invisible. Once we have the items we want to isolate selected, we just click on the solo button as shown here. Notice that the button turns red while we have objects isolated. Now we can make modifications to these objects and add new objects if we want without interference from the rest of our scene. This also makes test renders much faster since Bryce doesn't have to draw or even keep track of everything else. Now, when we're done, we just click on the solo button again, and we're back to the full scene. Placing these window openings and these reinforcement bars on this buckyball shape would have been impossible without isolation. So this is a good example of how useful it is. Now there are two different relational spaces that we can use in Bryce to our advantage. First is world space. This is the default space, and most of the time it's where I, at any rate, end up spending most of my time. In world space, the three axes we know and love are just where we expect them to be. So that up is up regardless of how much we've rotated an object. This is the way we want to place objects within a scene. If we switch to object space, up and down, left and right become relative to the orientation of any given object, as we can see here. So that moving this flattened sphere up with the reposition control moves it in the object's original up direction, regardless of where that points in relation to the rest of the world. Had this sphere been rotated another 9 degrees, moving it up would have actually sent it down to the right. This can be very confusing, but it's extremely useful as well, especially when it comes to stretching an object in any particular direction, because it does so without skewing the shape in any way other than what we intend. For example, in world space, if we were to stretch this rotated cube in the up direction along our y-axis, we would create a parallelogram, which is handy if we want a parallelogram, but very inconvenient if we don't. Obviously, we could just unrotate it first, then resize and re-rotate it. But that's not only a pain in the ass, in some situations it would just not be viable. It would not allow us to accomplish the adjustment we wanted relative to the objects it needs to be interacting with. In object space, however, when we stretch the cube upwards, we stretch it in precisely the way we want. Its corners will remain square, and we don't turn it into a parallelogram. It's usually helpful to switch back to world space before moving on, so that using the reposition tool yields predictable results. I'm trying to keep these tutorials from getting too long, so I think I'll pause for now and continue these Bryce 7 tips and tricks in a separate video, which I can hopefully get done within a reasonable amount of time. I hope at least some of you find at least some of this helpful. If you do, please let me know so I can stay motivated in doing more of these. Thank you.